Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. We're back with another ACC team preview today. We've got the Virginia Tech Hokies. Before we dive in, if you're liking what you've watched so far, please like and subscribe. We really appreciate all the support we've gotten thus far. But diving into the Hokies, starting on the offensive side of the ball, Cody, what strengths do you see in this Hokie offense?
Yeah, I think it's going to ultimately be the front court pairing of Amani Hansberry and Toby Lawal. I think it's probably one of the more underrated duos in the league, and I think it obviously starts with Lawal's athleticism. I mean, he's like a freak on the offensive glass. I mean, he had an 11% offensive rebound rate last season, but 14.1% at VCU as a freshman. So he just has an insane vertical, which makes it nearly impossible to keep him off the glass. And if he has a lower usage rate than he had last year, I believe it was around like 25%. And I think a guy like Hansberry is going to be able to open up his game, or at least allow Lawal to go back to where his game is at his best, which is on the offensive glass and playing in the dunker spot a little bit more often. I think that's going to suit both guys much better. And, I think Hansberry is going to have to, be a little bit of a hub for this offense at times. I think he has a versatile skill set, or at least an inside out skill set. I mean, he only shot at 29% from three on close to 4 attempts per game, which isn't great, but I really do think you have to honor him as a pick and pop threat. I think he's a better shooter than those numbers suggest. And I think they're going to have to run some offense through him as like a dribble handoff trigger man, or, playing through the high post or even playing through short roll. And then, like I said, having Lawal in that dunker spot is something that you really have to honor. And I think Hansberry is a good enough decision maker to be able to make the right choice, whether to kick it out to a shooter, score himself with he has solid touch and feel in the paint, or he could throw the lob to Lawal. So he's going to have a lot of options in that play type. So I do think he's a really important swing piece for this team, and I do think these two are going to work really well together in the high-low game. And Lawal himself can shoot it a little bit. I mean, he's going to need his time and space to knock it down, but he shot at 37% on 2 attempts per game. So I do think there's a little bit of spacing in the front court to help open up this perimeter offense as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the front court is definitely going to be the strength. I think both guys, Hansberry and Lawal, have extremely versatile games, right? Like they both have the ability to step out and knock down a shot or two, and they both, I think, have the ability to go off the bounce a little bit and create like Lawal more for himself. We saw a few times last year when he'd pop and then, to break somebody down and go off the bounce and punch one home. Hansberry, I think, has a little bit more ability to create for others. He had almost 14% assist rate last year. So I think, you'll see some usage out of him as a creator, like you said, Cody. I think that's going to be really the strength of this offense, or those two guys. They're going to be pretty heavily relied on, I think, in a lot of ways. And you bring up a good point about Lawal. If he's not, his usage rate isn't 25%, we might see more offensive rebounds. Even though last year he was 11%, might get back to more of that, 14%, like you said, at VCU. So I think that's definitely the strength of this Virginia Tech offense. As for weaknesses, Cody, what do you see in this Virginia Tech team?
Yeah, I'm not really in love with the perimeter group, to be completely honest. I think they're just lacking ACC level firepower, and a lot of the offense is going to have to go through Isaiah Pasha at the point guard position. Coming from Delaware, he has his concerns. He had an extremely low 3-point attempt rate, which creates somewhat of like a hazy outlook for a mid-major guard trying to transfer up. Just 19% of his shots came from 3 last year, and 42% of his overall field goal attempts came at the rim. And that's like the main play archetype that I have a concern with mid-major guards. It's like, are you really rim reliant? Do you rely on your rim efficiency? And he's a guy that really did. And he was efficient in that area, but it's just an unknown whether that's going to translate to power conference play. Playing against power conference athletes in the front court, it just creates some, at least a concern. Maybe he'll play up. He's a bigger guard, so maybe he'll be okay in this area. But he also turned the ball over a little bit too much, which I think creates. I mean, which it's ultimately because he doesn't space it all that well, and teams are able to pack it in a little bit. Like in pick and roll, teams can kind of play under his ball screen, and maybe he has to force a little bit too often. So I think that could ultimately become an issue. And I think a guy like Neoclis Avdalis is going to receive some on-ball usage as well, but he has perimeter scoring issues of his own. He's like a wider framed wing that likes to use his size to create separation and score at the rim. And just the guy that I watched on tape that looks a little bit uncomfortable with his jumper. And he did shoot at 40% from three on low volume in the league. He played in Greece last season, but he really struggled off the catch overall. So I'm not really sure how much of an off-ball role he's going to provide. He's going to provide all of his value on the ball, which there's a lot of guys on this roster that create value with the ball in their hands. So it's going to hopefully not create more of a your turn, my turn aspect to this offense, just because Mike Young offenses are predicated off of some off-ball movement, off-ball shooting. Like a guy like Hunter Couture a couple of years ago is like just a perfect fit for a Virginia Tech offense, and I just think they lack that a little bit this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's glaring. The strength is the front court offensively. The weakness is certainly the back court, particularly creation-wise. There's just not much of it, really, if any, at all. And like you mentioned with Pasha, 59% at the rim, but that's at Delaware. That's in the CAA. It's not the ACC. On a team that isn't very strong at the guard spot. And so, if that's your primary creator and guy who relies on getting to the rim, like he's going to get guarded by, the other team's best guard defender. And, how that really translates, I'm pretty skeptical of that. I'm also like not very high on this team's shooting ability. You talked about a couple of years ago, with Couture and Padula, most of this team is like 27 to 35%. And the ones that are on the higher end of that is they haven't had a ton of volume. So like I'm pretty skeptical on the shooting ability of this team. I think it could in turn like end up making life pretty difficult on Hansberry and Lawal at times, just because there's just not as much space to work because the shooting isn't overly efficient. But I think it's really the guard depth or the guard, not just depth, but guard play in general that's going to be the downfall of this team.
Yeah, and like don't get me wrong, like there are some spacing options on this offense. Like Jaden Shutt is a good off-ball shooter. He's just not like as high level as maybe he needs to be for an offense that kind of lacks perimeter creation. Like who's going to create the looks for him overall? Like I'm not super high on Pasha, like I mentioned, and Avdalis might need some time at the Division I level. And then Jalen Bedford as well, coming from UNLV, he shot it really well at Oral Roberts a couple of years ago as well. So those guys are going to be options. It's just a matter of like how much are those guys going to play and what do their roles look like next season. And Mike Young offenses are predicated off of floor efficiency, and his teams within like since 2015 they've all finished within at least the top 140 in 3-point shooting percentage on like pretty high volume. And he's had a few teams that were top 10 in the nation shooting the ball. And his team that they've really like his offenses have really correlated with how well do you shoot it. And if there's concerns with this area, then that creates some real concerns with this overall offense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I'm pretty skeptical of that unit. On the defensive side, what are your strengths here?
I think positional size and rebounding are probably the main strengths for me. I mean, there's nobody under 6'4" in the projected starting lineup. I would say Jaden Shutt is probably the weak link on this roster, but the other pieces I think bring positive traits that can, kind of mask Jaden Shutt as a defender. Like Isaiah Pasha was a pretty good defender on a bad Delaware defense. So I do think he's a little bit better of a defender than people think, and I think his size will play up at the point guard position. A guy like Avdalis is he plays with physicality, so I think that's going to be somewhat valuable, and I think that'll make him a solid positional rebounder. Then a depth piece like Tyler Johnson is a really above average rebounder off the wing, and I think he's a real defensive impact. And then like the Wall and Hansberry up front is a solid rebounding duo. Like Hansberry's not fantastic, but I think Lawal playing the four is going to be able to mask a lot of that. So I do think this is a pretty it's a pretty solid defensive group. I don't think it's like a needle moving defensive group in the ACC. Like I don't see them as like a top 5 unit in the league, but I do think it's pretty rock solid.
Yeah, I kind of had the same thing. My note was like positional size and versatility. I think like this should be a team that can switch a lot of things, can do a lot of different things on this side of the ball, just because, like you mentioned, the smallest guy should be 6'4" most of the time, if not all the time. So I think that's going to play into Mike Young's hands a little bit because they'll just be very versatile. They should be able to rebound the ball pretty well with that size. One would think, one would hope. So I think that's really the strength of this defensive unit, and having like Lual and Hansberry on the back end to be solid defensive rebounders. Like I think, like you said, you kind of described it very well. It's a rock solid unit. Like it's not gonna wow you, but it's also not, I think, a unit that's gonna like really hurt you. So I think it's gonna have to be the strength of this team. I think just because the offensive concerns are what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how I would describe a lot of Mike Young defenses. Like he's not going to wow you with like athleticism across the board. He plays a more passive scheme. Like he's more of an analytically savvy head coach. So like he's always going to have a high floor. But I do think the perimeter options are better than usual, I would say, at the guard position. I think they really upgraded on that side of the ball this year, especially with the backcourt size, I think is going to give them a real opportunity to be a solid unit in this league.
Yeah, for sure. As for weaknesses, what do you see? What do you see here?
My main concern was the lack of like a true defensive anchor. Like as good as Lawal is, I think he's more of a weak side rim protector. I don't think he's able to take on a ton of responsibility as a defender, mostly because of like some foul trouble concerns when he is the primary defender. He like a couple of years ago at VCU, he really struggled with fouls, but last year I think he cleaned it up a little bit. But if Hansberry is going to be playing the five in a more passive like drop scheme, it would be nice to have like a true rim anchor that you could filter everything into. And Amani Hansberry just isn't really that guy. He had a 1.9% block rate last year at West Virginia. He played for a really good defense, so maybe he's able to be a little bit better than the numbers say for him. But he had a 1.7 defensive box plus minus, which went for you know I think he was like the fifth or sixth most impactful defender on the West Virginia roster. So I mean, it was a really good roster. So no real fault there, but I just think like there are some issues with the primary rim protection and in a scheme that's not going to force a ton of turnovers. Like having that base, like having that foundation of a 2 point defense, I think is really important. And there are like some small concerns there, which is why ultimately I don't think this is like a groundbreaking defense that's going to crack into the top 25 nationally.
Yeah. I had a similar thing. Well, I had rim protection as one, and the other just as like the front court depth in general. The rim protection, like you said, Lual, I think was like 3.1%. Hansberry was sub 2%. So they don't really have like you said, an anchor to protect the rim. And then we talked about the size, right? Positional size. Everyone, however, on this roster is like 6'4" to 6'8". There's no like true big time size depth coming off the bench. Like you've got Hansberry and Lawal, who are both 6'8", and while like they're good athletes, they're not like menaces as rim protectors. And there's no real like big body to come in at like 6'10" or 6'11". It's really just those two guys, and just some uncertainty elsewhere. So those are my two main concerns. I think both in the front court on this team. Like obviously the size is great across the board, but when you look at the bigs in general, a little bit on the smaller side.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that that's a concern, particularly with the depth. If a guy like Hansberry isn't able to take on a lot of responsibility on the defensive end, I could see where this unit struggles a bit. I mean, there are some pieces like, 4-star Christian Gerdak coming in and Sincere Jones possibly providing some value on the wings, and then a German recruit, Antonio Dorn, is a 7-footer. It's just at this point in time, there's like, that's a lot of unknown with what those guys are going to bring. We're going to have to see that from night number 1 of the season, what their roles are going to look like. But at this point in time, I think it's fair to say that depth is a small concern.
Yeah. So what do you see MVP X factor for this team?
My MVP, I went with Toby Lawal. I think he's going to impact the game in a few too many areas to not make him the guy here. I think particularly on the offensive glass and his overall rim efficiency and his above the rim qualities in general, I think are going to be very valuable for this offense. For a Mike Young team that typically doesn't like pop with athleticism, I think he brings like a different style to his schemes. So I think that's really going to help this team out again this season. And for my X factor, I went with Amani Hansberry. I think he's going to be another guy that's going to have to generate offense in a ton of areas, like the areas I mentioned earlier, like in the dribble handoff game as the trigger man, in short roll, and as a pick and pop threat as well. I think, and even a little bit in the low post if this perimeter offense is just much worse than, we don't project it to be all that great, but even if it falls below our expectations, I think he's going to have to be like somewhat of a post hub for this offense. So I think his scoring efficiency and his ability as a playmaker ultimately makes him the X factor.
Yeah, I actually had the same spots. I think Toby Lawal MVP. He's kind of like, for anyone that's watched our other previews, he kind of fits the type of guy that I've made my MVP in some of these like teams that don't have a clear like really, really good player. Like he's a good player that can do a lot of things, and I think he's going to impact the game in a lot of ways for Mike Young. And then similarly, Hansberry, I think, is the X factor coming over from West Virginia. I think he is going to be able to play alongside Lawal, and they're going to be able to do some things together. I think they're going to be able to impact the game in a lot of similar ways. I just think like Lawal is going to have a little bit more to offer, which is why I made him the MVP. But bold prediction, ceiling and floor, Cody, for Virginia Tech.
Yeah, my bold prediction, more of a stat category for a particular player. I think Hansberry is going to have the ball in his hands so much at the top of the key that I think he has potential to lead this team in assists. I think he can get to 3.5 or 4, and I think that's going to be enough to do the job. And we're not particularly high on Pasha like translating up to ACC level basketball, so there could be there's an avenue for him to only get 20 to 25 minutes a game on this roster. So I think Hansberry ultimately ends up being like the high usage post hub, operating from the top of the key. So I think he ultimately leads the team in assists. But ceiling floor, I would say it's just hard for me. There's not a ton of eye popping traits. There's not a ton of upside with this team overall. So I think maybe landing themselves on the bubble, I think, is a potential ceiling outcome here. but the floor I think is fairly low. I think the floor is probably bottom 5 ACC, especially with the perimeter concerns that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I said middle of the pack, which I think in turn makes you a bubble team. Is the ceiling. Floor is bottom 4. And that leads me kind of into my bold prediction. It's like they do finish bottom 4, and Mike Young unfortunately like gets fired. Like I'm a Mike Young fan. I do like him as a coach, but this will be what, year 7, I think, at Virginia Tech, and a couple of tough seasons the last few. I don't think it necessarily is deserved, but I think if they have another like pretty bad year, I could definitely see Virginia Tech moving on from him. And I don't really have that high of expectations for this team, so I could see that being the case.
I could see it. I don't know if this is going to be the year that it happens. I mean, if the bottom falls out, I guess there's a potential. I mean, they were 148th rated on Torvik last season, and besides that, I think they've had some pretty solid teams. I mean, he's made 2 tournaments so far in 6 years, which I think we could probably consider that a success, or maybe that was the expectation. But there's there hasn't been a team that he's had that has had like true like title or Final Four upside, which obviously that's not expected. But
and let me ask you this: like, is he still there right now if they don't go on that run in the ACC tournament and win? What was it, 5 games in 5 days and win the tournament as whatever they were, a double-digit seed?
I think he is, because the next year they were pretty good. The next year it was 2021 where they went on that run, I believe, and made the tournament.
Yeah.
The next year they finished 18th in Torvik.
Yeah.
So I mean he had a really good team. I mean he had Justin Mutz, Padula, Couture. Like I think he knows how to recruit with the budget that he has. I mean, obviously it's not going to hit every single season, and like a lot of this is going to be predicated on how much money do you have, and if you're a step behind in the ACC, like how are you able to find like hidden values that you don't have to pay $2 million for? So it's just, I don't think he did like a fantastic job this year, but I guess it remains to be seen.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. But that'll wrap it up for Virginia Tech. We'll see what they have in store for us this year, and we'll see you next time on the Mainly Hoops podcast.